Look at this place. Jen Greymane, king of Gilneas, gestured at the citadel towering over them. The same massive structure whose front gates they were striding through as he spoke. Through a large burly man, Greymane was dwarfed by the edifice they were entering, the arc of its front gate more than twice his height. The other kings nodded as they too passed through. A wall, a tower, and a single keep, he rumbled loudly, glaring at the half-completed buildings beyond. This is where our money's gone to? It's big, Thoris Trollbane pointed out. The terse Stromgarde ruler, as usual, wasting as few words as possible. Big is expensive. The other kings grumbled somewhat as well. They all grieved at the cost involved, especially since they, the alliance leaders, were sharing the expenses equally. How great a price do you put on safety? Commented the tall, slim young man near the front of the group. Nothing worth having comes cheaply. Several of the others ceased their grumbling at the subtle admonition. Varian, the recently crowned young king of Stormwind, had known safety and had been robbed of it. His realm had suffered greatly at the hands of the orcs during the First War. Much of the capital city in particular had been reduced to mere rubble. Indeed, how does the rebuilding go, Your Majesty? A whip-thin man in green naval garb asked politely. Very well, thank you, Admiral, Varian replied. Though Dalen Proudmoore was ruler of Cool Tiras, he preferred to use his naval title. The Stonemasons Guild is doing an excellent job, and I and my people owe them our gratitude. They're fine craftsmen, with skills to rival those of the dwarves themselves, and the city is rising higher and higher every day. He grinned at Greymane. Worth every copper, I'd say. The other kings chuckled, and one of them, tall and broad with graying blonde hair and blue-green eyes, caught Trollbane's gaze and nodded approvingly. Taranis, ruler of Lordaeron, had sponsored young Varian when the prince and his people had sought refuge from the Horde, and had taken the youth into his own home until such time as Varian could be restored to his father's throne. Now that the time had come, and Taranis and his old friend Trollbane were well pleased with the results, Varian was a clever, charming, noble young man, a natural leader, and a gifted diplomat for one so young. Taranis had grown to think of him almost as a son, and he now took nearly a father's pride in admiration of the way the youth had controlled the conversation and distracted the other rulers from their previous complaints. In fact, Varian continued, pitching his voice slightly louder, there's the miracle worker himself. The king indicated a tall and powerfully built man, speaking animatedly with some dusty-looking workmen. The man in question had black hair and dark green eyes that sparkled as his head turned toward them, having clearly overheard the words. Taranis recognized Edwin Van Cleef, the head of the Stonemasons Guild and the man in charge of both Stormwind's restoration and the construction here at Netherguard Keep. Varian smiled and beckoned him over. Master Van Cleef, I trust the work continues apace? It does, Your Majesty, thank you, Van Cleef replied confidently. He banged a heavy fist against the thick outer wall and nodded proudly. It'll hold against all comers, sire, I promise you that. I know it will, Master Van Cleef, Stormwind's king agreed. You've outdone yourself here, and that takes some doing. Van Cleef nodded his thanks, then turned as another man somewhere by one of the unfinished buildings called for him. I'd best be back to work, Your Majesties. He bowed to the assembled rulers, then turned and hurried off toward the shouts. Nicely handled, Taranis said softly to Varian as they fell into pace together, diffusing Greymane and flattering the Van Cleef at the same time. The younger king grinned. It's an honest compliment, and he'll work all the harder because of it, he pointed out just as quietly, and Greymane only complains to hear the sound of his own voice. You've grown very wise for your age, Trina said, laughing, or perhaps just wise in general. Of course, Varian's hidden reprimand could not shut Greymane up for long. As they crossed the wide courtyard, Gilneas's king began grumbling again, and soon those rumblings in his thick black beard formed words once more. I know they are working hard, he admitted grudgingly, glaring at Varian, who grinned in reply. But why all these buildings? He waved a large hand at the single completed keep they were entering as they passed beneath the portcullis and up the stairs. Why go to so much trouble and cost to create such a vast citadel? It's only here to maintain watch over the valley where the portal once stood, is it not? Why would a simple keep not have sufficed? Khadgar, Archmage of Dalaran, exchanged tired but still slightly amused glances with his fellow wizards as Greymane's strong voice carried to them even before they entered the large meeting room. It's good to hear Greymane is his old self, Antonidas, leader of the Kirin Tor, commented dryly. Yes, some things never change, Khadgar replied, stroking his full white beard. He turned, his youthful quickness giving a seeming lie to his lined visage, to face the kings. You want to know what your money has bought you, then? He said to the newcomers, nodding, a brief greeting to them, but otherwise treating them as equals. For such they were, as Khadgar, a member of the Kirin Tor, was a ruler in his own right. Well, I'll tell you, and you can thank me. Netherguard Keep is large, yes, it has to be. Quite a few people will be living here. The Magi we brought here from Dalaran, as well as the soldiers who watch for more mundane threats. The valley below us was once the side of the Dark Portal, the Horde's entrance into our world. If they ever return, we'll be ready. That explains the warriors, Proudmoore agreed. But why these Magi you spoke of? Surely a single mage would be enough to monitor the situation and alert you of any danger? If that were all that was required, yes, Khadgar agreed, pacing the room. His strides were that of the young man he truly was. Khadgar was only a handful of years older than Varian, but he had been aged prematurely by the magic of Medivh just before the mage's death. But Netherguard is quickly becoming more than just a watch post. You can't possibly have missed the reason for our concern as you rode up. Something drained the life from Draenor, from the very land itself. When the Dark Portal was open, that lifelessness touched our world as well, killing the land around it and spreading outward. When we destroyed the portal, we thought the land would heal itself. It did not. In fact, the taint continued to spread. The kings frowned and looked at one another. That was news to them all. We began to study the situation and discovered that even with the portal gone, a small dimensional rift remained. That brought gasps from the assembled rulers. Did you find a way to stop the taint from spreading? Proudmoore asked. We did, though it took several of us working together to do so. A frown crossed his lined face. Unfortunately, we were unable to restore the land that had been damaged. This area was once the Black Morass, and we managed to protect the northern half and keep it in its former state. There are rumors that some orcs are still hiding out there, but we've not seen anything concrete. But the southern half, for whatever reason, we could not breathe life back into it. He shook his head. Someone took to calling it the Blasted Lands, and now the name has stuck. I doubt this land will ever be able to support life again. Still, you stopped the taint and saved the rest of the world's soil, Varian pointed out. That is incredible enough, given how rapidly the effect spread. Khadgar inclined his head, acknowledging the praise. We have done more than I dared hope, he admitted, though less than I might have liked. But a full contingent of Magi must remain here at all times to watch the area and make sure we lose no more of Azeroth to this strange taint. The Magi also monitor the rift itself at the same time, and that good majesties, is why Nethergard has to be so large and is costing so much. Is there really any risk that the rift might reopen? Trollbane asked, and the others turned back to Khadgar, clearly awaiting his answer, but worried about what it might be. He could read their thoughts on their faces. The idea of reliving what had happened 8 years before, when the portal had opened and the orcs had come pouring through, unnerved them all. Khadgar began to answer, but was interrupted by a shrill caw from just outside the meeting hall. I think the final member has just arrived by Griffin and landed on the wall walk, he said. The woman who entered the meeting room a few moments later was tall and almost unspeakably lovely. Worn-looking green and brown leather clung to her slim form as she strode toward them. Her golden hair was tousled, and she brushed it absently back from long pointed ears. Exquisite and delicate she might seem, but everyone present knew well that aLaria Windrunner was a formidable ranger, scout and fighter, and wilderness expert. Many of those present had fought in battle alongside her and owed their lives to her sharp eyes, quick reactions, and strong nerves. Khadgar, she said bluntly as she stepped up beside him, tall enough to almost look him eye to eye. aLaria, he replied. Affectionate nostalgia made the single word warm. They had been comrades in arms not so long ago, good friends fighting a good fight. But there was no warmth in her green-eyed gaze, nor on a face that, while beautiful, might have been carved from stone for all the animation it displayed. aLaria was courteous, but that was all. Inwardly, Khadgar sighed, stepping back through the door and gesturing for her to follow. This had better be good, she said as she entered the room proper, and nodded briefly to the various kings. Despite her willowy build and youthful golden looks, aLaria was easily older than any of the human rulers, which made her immune to, and often mocking of, their majesty. I was hunting orcs. You were always hunting orcs, Khadgar countered, more sharply than he intended, but that is part of why I want you here, for this. He waited until he had her full attention, and that of the various kings. I was just explaining that we've noticed a dimensional rift in the area where the dark portal once stood. And recently the energies emanating from it have increased dramatically. What does that mean? Greymane demanded. Are you trying to tell us it's getting stronger? The young old archmage nodded. Yes, we think the rift is about to expand. Has the Horde found some way to restore the portal? Trennis asked, just as shocked as the rest. Perhaps not, Khadgar answered. But even if they cannot create a stable portal again, once the rift alone is large enough, the orcs will once more have access to our world. I knew this would happen, Greymane all but shouted. I knew we hadn't seen the last of those green-skinned monsters. Beside him, aLaria's lips curved, her eyes growing bright in what was anticipation. How soon? Trollbane asked, and how many? How many we cannot say, Khadgar replied, shaking his head. How soon? Very. As little as a few days, perhaps. What do you need? Trennis asked softly. I need the Alliance army, Khadgar answered bluntly. I need the entire army here in case the rift does begin widening. It's quite possible we could have a second horde pouring out into the valley. He smiled suddenly. The sons of Lothar must step forward once again. The sons of Lothar. That's what they had taken to calling themselves, the veterans of the Second War. Victory had been bought, but at a dear cost. The death of the Lion of Azeroth, Anduin Lothar, who had been the man all were willing to follow. Khadgar had been there when he fell, slain by the orc chieftain Orgrim Doomhammer. And he'd been there when his friend Turalyon, now the general of the Alliance forces, had avenged Lothar by capturing Doomhammer. Lothar's protege, coming into his own, carrying on a heroic legacy, and thus in blood had been born the sons of Lothar. "You're sure about this rift?" Trinus asked carefully, clearly reluctant to offend a wizard. Which, Khadgar mused, was hardly ever a good idea, but in this case he wasn't offended at all. "I wish I weren't. The energy level is most definitely rising. Soon that energy will be enough to widen the rift, allowing the orcs to pour forth from Draenor onto our world." He felt suddenly tired, as if sharing the bad news had emptied him somehow. He glanced again at Ilaria, who noticed the gaze and lifted an eyebrow but said nothing. "We cannot afford to take chances," Varian pointed out. "I say we rally the Alliance army and make ready for war, just in case." "Agreed," Trinus said, and the others nodded their approval. "We'll need to contact General Turalyon," Varian continued. Ilaria stiffened slightly, a flicker of unreadable emotions crossing her face, and Khadgar's eyes narrowed. Once, the Elven Ranger and the human Paladin had been more than comrades in arms. They'd been good for each other, Khadgar had always thought. Ilaria's age and wisdom strengthened Turalyon's spirit, and his youth and innocence softened the somewhat jaded elf. But something had happened. Khadgar had never known what, and was discreet enough not to ask. An alarmingly cold distance had sprung up between Turalyon and Ilaria. Khadgar had felt sorry for them at the time. Now he wondered if this distance would cause problems. Varian appeared not to have noticed the subtle change in Ilaria and continued. "As commander of the Alliance army, it's his job to gather our soldiers and prepare them for what lies ahead. He's in Stormwind now, helping us rebuild our defenses and train our men." An idea occurred to Khadgar, one that might solve two problems at once. "Ilaria, could you reach Turalyon more quickly than anyone else?" "Ilaria, you could reach Turalyon more quickly than anyone else. Take the Griffin and head to Stormwind. Tell him what's happened and that we'll need to reassemble the Alliance army immediately." The Elven Ranger glared at Khadgar, her green eyes flashing fire. "Surely another could accomplish the trek as easy," she stated, her tone sharp. But Khadgar shook his head. "The Wildhammers know and trust you," he answered, "and these fellows have their own arrangements to make." He sighed. "Please, Ilaria, for all our sakes, find him, tell him, and bring him here. And maybe you two can settle your differences, or at least decide to work together," he thought. Ilaria's glare hardened into that implacable, expressionless mask. Implacable? "I will do as you have requested," she said almost formally. Without another word, she turned and stalked back across the hall and out the front doors. "Khadgar's right," Trinus said as they watched her walk away. "We'll need to rally our troops and gather supplies, and right away." The other kings nodded. Even Greymane was quietly compliant. Thought of the horde returning had shocked any griping clean out of him. Together they moved toward the doors, heading back into the courtyard and from there toward the massive front archway they had first passed under not an hour before. Archway. "I go," Khadgar whispered as he watched the kings depart.